welcome to another episode of the Perceptive podcast for our series here on Game Wisdom. For tonight, my guest runs the channel Indie Game Clinic, and they're currently working on the game Dirtworld. And they're on to discuss that, as well as game design academia. So please welcome Joe Baxter. How are you doing?
Josh, thank you for having me. I'm doing great. It's cool to be here. It's an interesting one. I've sort of been on your blog and stuff years and years back. You know, I've dipped into Game Wisdom when I've needed pull quotes for academia and stuff like that. So it's kind of unusual to be here now. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks again for reaching out. And yeah, as I always tell people, if you are interested in coming on for one of these episodes, feel free to get in touch. I have a sign-up form. Just any which way is fine. But yeah, once again, thank you so much for signing up. And this is going to be another fantastic conversation. So, to get the ball rolling, since it's your first time on, can you talk a little bit about kind of who you are and what is your background?
Yeah, of course. So I've been making games professionally for like 10 years and unprofessionally for longer than that. You know, I've been making games since I was a kid, but I got a job in a mobile studio about 10 years ago, did that for a couple of years, then went into academia and was teaching design for a couple of years, and then went back into industry. And then recently, over the last couple of years, I've been building up my YouTube channel, Indie Game Clinic. I am working on a game currently. I see that more as a hobby project. You know, my route was kind of like, oh, I can use what I know to do a YouTube channel. That seems like more plausible than being immediately successful with an indie game. So I'm sort of doing my own game on the side while I do the channel, and it gives me stuff to talk about on the channel. But the premise of the channel is really that it's all based around other people's games. It's a review channel. It's a work in progress review channel. I try and do what we do in a class. You know, if you've got like a final year class of students and everyone's playing each other's games, I try and kind of encourage that type of thing. Yeah, and then part of that's because I think once you get to a certain point, and you will know about this, once you get to a certain point in practice, you really have to be learning in a situated context of the project you're working on, rather than just people telling you like very broad generic statements about this is what good game design is, or this is what good game design is. It all becomes more and more specific like the deeper you get in. So but yeah, it's a good time at the moment because I get to do educational stuff, I get to do silly stuff through YouTube as well, and get time to work on my own projects. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think like one of the more like fascinating aspects has been like, at least from the academia side, and it's something that I've spoken with a lot of like teachers and educators over like the past like now like 14, 15 years. And how much like things I think have really changed in terms of I think like acceptance of being able to like study game design, games in the classroom. And like for long time listeners, you know, I tell the story a lot that when I was back in college in the mid 2000s, like all the colleges around here were phasing out their information technology, their computer programming. There was no game design whatsoever. And then, of course, like a year or two after I graduated, then they formally introduced a game design program. Yeah. But I guess, like from your perspective and like teaching now, what is it like? I guess like teaching game design in academia.
Ooh, I mean, I can start personal and then zoom out, I guess. But for me, so I helped found a course in Canterbury in the UK in 2018, and then I was there till 2023. Eventually became the course leader and everything. And it's interesting because for a start, you don't really teach pure design, even though the course is called game design. And some of that is because, I mean, people need to learn some sort of practical development skills to be able to make anything, right, by the end of the course, and people expect to actually make a game. So it's very rare to find a course called game design that is actually pure game design, rather than being a mixed development course where you do a bit of art and a bit of tech and all of that kind of stuff. So, you know, that's unusual because I'd already sort of worked as a game designer before that, and I'm well aware, and as you will be, you know, like the degree of hands-on technical work someone with the job title game designer does in a studio varies wildly. You know, in a massive studio, a game designer is a documents and theory and discussion person, and then in a smaller studio, a game designer might be much more of a technical designer where they wear multiple hats. You know, I've done design roles where I was very in engine doing a lot of level design and menu layouts and stuff like that, and other ones where I did nothing like that. So like the idea of doing a pure game design degree is kind of just not really plausible, and some of that is kind of market driven as well, because students don't know the difference between design and development, so they sign up for a design course and you kind of have to give them what they want to a degree. So yeah, I think any course that's titled game design ends up being like a sort of full spectrum introduction to everything to do with making games, even if that's not what design really is. And then you end up sort of doing the hard design stuff towards the end, because you have to front load so many technical skills to get people to even think about the pragmatics of actually building a game, right? So you end up doing all your intro to programming, intro to like creative direction or world building or whatever at the start. So it was always a bit challenging, I found. And I think, and then the reason why I don't teach at university anymore, and why it would be difficult to tempt me back really, is that you get loads and loads of students who haven't done the thing at all before they join the course, which was always quite challenging. And I always found that quite bizarre, you know. And I think some of it's a generational difference. I'm old enough that we had like computers at home that were really slow, you know, like I had an Amstrad CPC with tapes and stuff. When I started programming, it was because I was bored. There wasn't anything else to do. There was like a manual that had some how to make blackjack in BASIC, and it was quicker to do that than it was to load up a game on a tape cassette, because the tape cassette would scream at you for 10 minutes before you got a game, you know. So the kind of hobbyist background that a lot of us like older folks come from doesn't exist anymore, because younger people are so media saturated. And that means when you've got a course, it's like you have a group of people who've done it before, who are like the people you're there to teach, or the people you imagine who are going to be there. And then there's a bunch of other people who are just like, they've been told they need to go to college when they're 18, and they just go, oh, that sounds fun. And they join a course in a discipline they've never really tried, you know. Like I would think the ideal, and you know, I'm sounding really negative. If someone's listening to this who is thinking of going down that route, just do it as a hobby first, you know. Do like make a board game, mod a existing game. Just get involved in making something for some people to play on some level, because it's really astounding the amount of people that enter courses who have never engaged with it before at all. So yeah, that's the kind of stuff really. But I did find teaching quite enjoyable. But you really, the funny thing about game design is you have a group of people that need to learn to do it because they've learned like the technical side of game dev, right? And then they realize, oh, I can do all this stuff, but what I'm making isn't very fun. Now it's time for me to learn game design, right? And that might be like 5 or 10 years into their journey as a developer. They've been learning technical skills and like how to use a game engine for ages, but they've never really engaged with all the kind of player psychology and stuff that we do until they realize way too late that they need to engage with that. And then you've got another group of people, and if you imagine like I don't know, a YouTube channel like Game Maker's Toolkit, like what Mark Brown does, right? Or even what you do, like more kind of design theory heavy stuff. There's an audience for that where it's just people that really enjoy understanding how games work, but they don't necessarily make games, right? And it's kind of like you used to get people that studied literature to improve their appreciation of literature. I suppose you still do, right? Like people that use theory just to enjoy something more or to understand what it means culturally. And there's like a massive group of people that study game design just for that reason, and maybe understand game design better than these other people over here who've been using a game engine for 10 years, but really just thinking about like how do I make this code better? How do I make these things move around on the screen better? That kind of stuff. And that's really funny in the indie space because you know that if you grab these people and you could get them to help each other out, you'd end up with a great team. But like that's a whole other set of skills to learn. So um, yeah, it's the I guess what I'm getting at is you've got design and it can be embedded in development or it can be this whole other topic on its own, you know. And there are people kind of on either extreme in terms of how much they engage with kind of game design and game design educational materials that are out there.
Hmm. I think that's a very interesting point about how like some people can like enter the space either all like programming and technical side with no design sense, or all
Mm.
design sense and like no like technical or programming skills. And it's one of those I think the very interesting challenge when it comes to game development because you need to have I think both, especially in today's market. If you want your game, if you want a chance to succeed. If you don't make any design sense, you can end with something that is technically sound but nobody wants to play it, or you end with this amazing idea that just breaks computers the second they try and run it. And I guess I guess here's an interesting question for you. Like coming at it like with someone with a technical skill but no design sense, are
Mm.
there any like common mistakes or I guess like common things you see from someone like as like a completely first time, never touched game design, never studied design that they tend to mess up on, or something that you have to kind of try and instill or teach them about it?
Yeah. And I'll flip that round first because the other type of person you're talking about is me, right? So I can program, but I kind of see it almost like a necessary evil. I'm not very good at it. I've never got. So currently, the game that we're working on, Dirtworld, I started working with a game maker programmer called Gleb, who has way more experience than me and makes tools. And initially, sort of working with him because he was showing me how to use his libraries. And then I hired him, and now he's sort of doing a lot of the technical backend and tooling for the game. And that's been a really good experience, partly because he's a really good mentor as well. So he's not just sort of doing stuff and then not showing me how it works. He's sort of showing me how it works as we go. So I'm sort of skilling up. So I'm definitely on that side of things. It's like I have the design sensibilities. You know, I've made countless board games, homebrewed, tabletop things, but most of my time working in industry has been in places with dedicated programmers. So it's like I don't have to do that. I don't have to practice that skill. When you get people who come more from that side, there are a few common pitfalls. I think they're like understanding that the value of what you're doing is in the player experience is the big one. That's like the big meta level thing that people need to understand. And you can see when they don't understand that because they're just sort of throwing features into the game and not thinking about what they do or how they interact and stuff like that. I think the most common one that I see, and you know, I have games sent into the channel, and like you do as well, lots of kind of play tests on video and stuff. The one that I see most commonly is it's like people have looked at the full feature set of the game they want to make. You know, they want to make an RTS or they want to make a third-person action beat 'em up, and they've looked at another game and they've gone, oh, here's all the stuff that's in that game, and then they've just set about making every single part of the game and trying to make something that most resembles a finished game as quickly as possible without ever showing it to anyone, you know, rather than the, you know, what we would usually recommend for a game like that, which is you prototype the core loop, you see how it feels, you come up with the concept for the theme and the setting, you see how that feels, you see if that appeals to people, you see how it blends with the core mechanics, and you sort of, you know, Jesse Shell's book, he talks about it as parallel prototyping, right? You know, you make separate prototypes of different things, and even like concept art is a form of prototyping, and you don't blend everything together into one project until you're starting to get certain of it. And that's the thing that I think people most struggle with. It's just that idea that like player input is a thing that you need from the beginning of the project. It's not, you know, people often, I think Steam is really muddying the waters around this at the moment because of the kind of what they call a demo and what they call a play test and all of this kind of stuff. And there's like people putting up demos, and in my mind, a demo is still what it was in the shareware 90s. You know, a demo is a chunk of a commercially finished game that is like, here is the end quality of the game. This is what you'll get if you buy the game. You know, it's a sale by sample method, but lots of people put out demos that are nowhere near at the point where they need to be ready and stuff like that. And I think it's just really just a lot of people that are from that more technical background, or kind of from any hobbyist background that maybe haven't worked in any kind of serious studio before they go into making a game. They just don't understand that idea of like proving and validating a concept before you go all in on producing it, you know?
With like trying to, I guess, like get like that concept going. That's always been like that challenging aspect because, as you said, like if you're coming at this, I think like surely from like a technical or programming side, you may not be thinking about the new player's experience, even just somebody playing your game. And it's always like funny to me with like some of the games that I cover that I can sometimes just like laser focus on like a major quality of life issue, like something like even as innocuous as no volume sliders, or even just trying to use like general genre conventions, and the UI is just set up all weird. Like you're using IOPL for movement instead of WASD, and it's always like that kind of like strange thing. And like to go back to what you said a few minutes about like people going into like a space with like no background whatsoever in game design, that is always fascinating about like what is considered like basic level knowledge when it comes to game design, because there really isn't, I think, an answer to that, because every genre is basically its own vocabulary you have to try and teach someone.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And it's really funny that you point towards that, because whenever I put out a video essay that's on a topic, I get a cluster of people that say, oh, I've never thought of it this way, you've reframed this, and then I get a cluster of people that is like, oh, this is baby stuff, what are you still talking about?
Mm-hmm.
There isn't like, yeah, you're totally right, there's stuff that there isn't like a clear hierarchy of what order you should learn game design stuff in. Some people start with processes, right? Some people start with like, here is how we write a game design document, here is how we prototype, and that can be very, very helpful for people. And some people start with the human aspect of like more kind of UX. Here is how humans chunk information. I think you can become a very, very good game designer just by studying all of that side of things, like neuroaesthetics, cognitive design, all of those kind of things. But yeah, the whole thing about a genre being like a set of people get too into thinking about genres in terms of marketing, right? And like, oh, I'm going to make one of these because it's popular right now, or these aren't doing very well right now. It's like this very speculative way of thinking about games, which I genuinely don't approve of it. But one of the reasons I don't approve of it is because like if every genre is its own language, right? You get conversant in a language by not just, you have to play the type of games you make, I guess is what I was trying to get to there. And playing is like reading, and then dev is like writing, right? So you learn a language by reading it and listening to it, and then you learn to speak it. And I think these things that you're talking about, like these people not using the control conventions and stuff, it's often just that they're not fans of the genre of game that they're making, or they're doing it completely from memory, So people go, oh, there was this game I played when I was 8 on the Super Nintendo, I'm going to make that. And they don't really go back and look at it, or or look at more recent games and look at how they would control a similar thing. And they just sort of, it's like trying to draw a picture from memory. It's just never going to be as good as like actually studying the thing. So, yeah, there's a big challenge there in terms of what do you learn in what order, and I don't have the answer. I think it always comes down to treating it as a practice, and good games. You see this, songwriters talk about this as well. You get Rick Rubin, for example. Rick Rubin gets bands to record like 40 songs, and then they will throw away 30, and then they've got an album of 10 songs. Create anything creative is a practice. You produce a lot of stuff, most of it's crap, and then the more that you do, the more chance there is of something being good. And I think people really get het up on this idea of like wanting the first thing they do to, or wanting everything they do to be good. And I don't know how you get people over that apart from normalizing like good practice and putting people in situations where they can see other people kind of sharing their ropey prototypes and stuff like that.
Yep. And that kind of, as you said, like the obsession of trying to make like your first project, like the most perfect one. That
Mm.
has definitely been something that I've seen a lot, especially covering like indie developers in the 2010s when kind of like indie dev was at its most infancy, at least in terms of the mainstream approach. That so many people got into it thinking, I'm going to spend the next 5 to 10 years on one game. That's it. Like my goal is get that one game out. It's going to succeed, and it's riches and fortune from that point on. And then when we fast forward to like today, or maybe more so like the last like 3 or 4 years, like when I interview developers now, they're like, I don't want to spend more than like 18 months on this game. Like the thought of spending like 5 years sounds like a death sentence to me. And it really, I think, has shifted how much, I guess, like the practice when it comes to like game development and indie game dev has really changed since, things really blew up in the 2010s.
Yeah, I get the impression there are a lot more people who are motivated by the success rather than enjoying the thing and then thinking, oh, maybe I could be successful doing this thing. And I don't think, certain types of coverage of how indie games are talked about don't help that. Um, it's difficult, isn't it? Because like the way I usually describe this to people when I'm sort of mentoring or teaching is that when people say don't start with your big crazy game idea, it's not because they don't believe in you. It's because the first few years should just be learning to do the thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you try lots of different things and you iterate really quickly and you jump around between things, you'll learn quicker. And the criteria for success this is like a general business thing. This isn't just a game dev thing. But I was reading Kim Nordstrom's book, Up Down Up. We do like a little book club. We've got a podcast where we just read books about game dev. Kim Nordstrom interviewed all of these different senior people at like Blizzard, Paradox, loads of different studios, different types of studios, and found this model that they all had, which was basically, and this is going to sound really obvious, but they spend a bit of time experimentally finding out what their studio is good at, and then they just do that. And and you see this it becomes self-evident when you look at game studios. Like game studios make sequels not because they're creatively lazy, but because they're getting better at doing the same thing. Just like any kind of creative factory will get tooled up to build a particular thing. And it's the same with individual solo devs. You're going to learn a set of skills, and that's why Jonathan Blow's games have something in common, and that's why Lucas Pope's games have something in common, and Derek Yu's games have something in common. It's not just that that's what they like to make. It's also that as you practice something and you develop your skills, you also develop a sense of what you enjoy doing, right? And that's important for finishing projects, right? Because if you spec something into your game that you don't like doing, and you've already committed to the idea that, well, I'm going to do that, someone else isn't going to do that, then you're creating a situation where you're setting yourself up to fail, And the worst example I see of this sometimes is like people pick a genre that has a sort of a content requirement that they don't really want to do. Like the classic one is someone makes like a JRPG style life sim game where you can walk around a town and talk to all the characters, and they clearly don't enjoy writing those characters. So I played a game like this last year. The dev had been working on it for years and years, and they had a combat system, an inventory, all of the things you'd expect from like a 90s top-down JRPG. And loads of the characters in the town still had placeholder dialogue when you walked up to them. And it was just like, you clearly don't enjoy doing this part of the game. You either need to get someone else to do it for you, or you need to just be a little bit more self-aware about your own likes and dislikes, and don't make a game that has this content requirement for loads of a type of thing that you clearly don't enjoy doing it. Because you can tell that when you look at people's projects. What do they enjoy doing? Because that's the thing that gets the most time spent on it, especially when it's like a hobbyist project. You're doing it in your own time. You can spend your time how you want. You can step back from it at some point. You can go, wow, I really, really like doing VFX, and I really, really don't like programming interfaces, you know? And that's the sort of information, if you're reflective, that can tell you what type of game you should be making, which is like the thing that requires more of that and less of that, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good kind of like parallel to like game design or video game academia. That you can't, it's you can tell when someone is doing something that they really are passionate about. And as I was saying like a few minutes ago, like because there is no like standard for like what makes a video game or what genres you're focusing on, you have to be very mindful, as you said, of what is kind of like the language of this genre that you're working in. If you're saying to yourself, well, I want to make a JRPG, but I hate turn-based combat, something is, not really meshing right. Just as like saying, I want to make a first-person shooter, but I hate, I hate first person or I hate reflex gameplay. Like just because someone else is making it doesn't mean that you should be doing that. And that's like think another like interesting trap I've seen a lot of developers fall into. Like as another like long-standing comment around here, I can regale everyone as many, pop game cycles that we've had over the past 16 years. From the Darkest Dungeon clones to the FTLs to, as we just saw recently, with all the games copying Balatro and so on.
Mm-hmm.
That I think some developers feel like it becomes a necessity to copy a game because they saw if game A did really well, then surely I can make a game that's just like it, or even just like a quarter of that success. But if you're trying to make a game and you absolutely hate those mechanics or you hate those systems, it's never going to really come off as well. And to your point or to your example about, writing in a JRPG, like if you're bad at writing or you hate writing dialogue, I would say it's better just to cut that section entirely because it's better to have your game fire on all cylinders than saying, well, my game features great combat, but all the dialogue's horrible. Because a lot of people just harp on, well, all your dialogue's horrible, and just write reviews about that time and time again.
Yeah, yeah. I think the kind of jumping on the bandwagon and trying to copy a certain type of game because it's just been popular as well. I think it sort of part of the reason of it is that people don't really follow the development of the games they're interested in a lot of the time. We were talking about before about maybe some people being a bit more money motivated now or a bit more success motivated. And I see it with a lot of like game dev podcasts where everything is about how many units someone sold or whatever. I think, if you use FTL as an example or Darkest Dungeon as an example, if the developers that were interested in replicating those games had paid attention to how they were designed, right, rather than what they were, they would have seen that those developers didn't get success by following formulas, right? Or rather, they got success by going through this process we've been talking about of like taking things from different places and then working out what you're good at. Like Darkest Dungeon wouldn't have worked if it hadn't been a team of a particular set of people and one of them being like a really good comic book artist. Those types of things. But yeah, I mean, it's maybe it's just a bit too much to expect people to be like really into this kind of like self-reflection and everything. But I think if you want to like make it really kind of commercial and industrial, I see it as when you're making a factory, you tool it up to make certain stuff, right? You don't have a factory that can make absolutely everything. You have a factory with particular machines in that can make a particular type of thing, and that's why Paradox make really good 4X games, and and solo devs can be totally exactly the same. There are certain activities in game development that I find I feel like pulling teeth. Like I'm currently making a platformer, and I'm pretty sure the next game I make will not be an action game about controlling a character. It will probably be a completely mouse-controlled PC native game that doesn't involve controller rebinding or anything like that, because it's not just that I don't enjoy doing those things, it's that I think that's quite a good limitation And I think I should have started out with that. I think one of the reasons why, I see lots of advice, don't make an action game, they don't sell very well on Steam. It's like, well, they can sell very well on Steam, but the bar for quality is a lot higher once you're dealing with like game feel and real time action and game feel and stuff like that. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think they're hard to pull off, but I think they're hard to pull off as a solo developer who isn't also like an animator and all of these other things.
Mm-hmm. And game feel is such an important like aspect of a lot of what we talk about when it comes to game design. Because to a point that you said earlier about how you can explain a topic to someone, half the people will say they've never heard before, and they'll have will say,
Hmm.
they've known about this all their lives. It's very hard, I think, to get someone new to understand what game feel means. Like to your, as you were just saying, with people who just kind of chase a popular genre, they'll see a Balatro or a Vampire Survivors or whatever, and they'll say, "Well, I'll just make my game just like it." And 9 times out of 10, it turns out to be a very worse version of that game. Because
Mm.
just watching Vampire Survivors gameplay doesn't really explain to you, or doesn't really, I think, educate you as to what that game did so well. And I wrote about this last year when I went back to the game with the whole like Castlevania DLC. And I said,
Mm.
for a game that's like now considered the old version of the genre, it still feels one of the best ones to play. And it's hard, I think, to teach someone that because you can show footage of like 10 different platformers. That can be 10 completely different jump mechanics and jump physics.
Hmm.
And you're never going to, I think, really see that by just watching footage. It's why I, stress so much you have to play these games. Um,
Mm.
with Hollow Knight Silksong last year, that again, like you can watch footage of Silksong, you can put that juxtaposed to the original Hollow Knight, and people will just say, "Well, it's just the same thing." Anyone who's played Silksong knows it is very different to move around in that game than it is in the base game.
Yeah.
But again, you're never going to get that just by watching footage.
Right, and that difference as well, it's not necessarily just, oh, the team got better and this is what is better, so they're doing that. One of the things with making sequels is often people want a new game to learn, right? They don't want to just if you go down that route of like this is kind of what Raf Costa is very into, just like games as you are learning to do a thing, right? It's all mastery, and that's the satisfaction of playing a game. It's like you want a sequel to be slightly different. You want the character to be different to master, because otherwise, if you've just finished playing the first game, you go into the second game, it's not really a new game. It's just a continuation, right? And this is, if you think of a totally different type of game, this is why, if you go back to JRPGs, if you go to Final Fantasy games, completely different set of systems every single game, right? Because that genre fandom has an enjoyment of learning complex systems, and that's what they're going to the game for. Of course, they're going for the fantasy and the characters and all of that as well, but the game needs to be different each time. Otherwise, it's just like it feels like a DLC of the first game. You're still applying the same skills. So if you have a character and you make them slightly different to control, then it's just way more compelling. That's why like arena shooters, like character-driven arena shooters, are so compelling as well. One of the things I loved about Overwatch when it came out is it's like, okay, each character only has 2 weapons or whatever, but they all feel like I'm playing a different game. Like playing Junkrat feels like I'm playing Quake and I'm jumping around corners with grenades and stuff. And then, they all feel like a different subgenre of shooter. That would be a really good, if I were running a class now, if I would probably use Overwatch quite a lot. And I would be like, hey guys, we're gonna like play each character in Overwatch and talk about how different they feel in terms of like weight and stuff like that. But yeah, um, game feel very hard thing to convey, as you say, and it's like you need to actually be doing the thing. It's like it's the player is performing, right? And just like you would in a sport or a dance or something like that. And it's like if you're watching a sport on the TV, you're going to understand it more if you've done the sport yourself, right? If you're like a active doer of that thing, and you can sort of see what the people are doing, and you can go, oh yeah, I remember what that feels like and stuff like that. But with a video game, it's like everyone, like you say, like even within the same genre, every single one of those is slightly different, you know. Um, yeah, I've got that pack they released on Steam of all of the handheld Castlevanias from like the early 2000s, and they're all kind of the same in terms of like the art and the way that they're built, but then each character has a slightly different move set. And that's not like a linear development. They didn't add one move every time. They like added one and took one away, so you'd have a different kind of character set of things to learn. I found that quite an interesting little kind of study to run through those again.
Mhm. And what you said a moment ago that I thought was really poignant about people thinking that when a game changes something, it's because that is considered the better way of doing it. Like, I think that's another very like easily stepped on trap for a lot of people. Going back to this idea that a game must include this, and if the game
Mm-hmm.
doesn't include that, then it's obviously bad. Because you'll see a lot of people like when they talk about like classic games. Like a lot of the complaints I got in some of my design books I wrote was people saying, "Well, you didn't spend enough time talking about Super Mario World or Final Fantasy." I'm like, "Yeah, those games are 20 years old. No, they're 30 years old now. Wow, I get to be really old." Like, if I'm talking about modern game design, why would I be teaching you about game design practices in 1991? It doesn't. It'll say, "Well, those games are really great." Yeah, they're really great 30 years ago. And it's so easy, I think, for a lot of people to fall into that mindset that if Game A sold really well, we just copy everything Game A did. It did everything right. So if we do what Game A did, our game will be just as great. But one, the market changes. And this is something that whenever I speak to like any developers who have been doing this for like 5, 10 years plus, they will always comment about that. In that you can't just make what worked 1 year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years
Mm.
ago, because people have already played those games. Again, like for long time listeners, you know I'm about to make this comment. If I already played Mario, Doom, Quake, SimCity, whatever, why would I want to spend $14.99, $20, even $5 on your version of those games when I can just go right back and play those classics?
And I think that's why finding some version of like minimalism is always good. It's like, oh, you want to make a city builder. What's a good way to make a smaller city builder that still feels satisfying? Because you're not going to make city skylines, right? So what's
Mm-hmm.
the kind of the smaller version? I did a video last year about design by constraint, where you go, well, we can't do this, so you know. And I think like a cool example of that uh, is in Pacific Drive. Did you play Pacific Drive?
Yes.
So it's like everything generically about that game is a survival crafting game, right? But because the theme is car maintenance, you don't have all of the features of a survival crafting game, right? You can't build a house, you can't chop down trees. All you can do is like harvest metal from things with a tool. And that's a really neat example of the theme like contracting the design space, because it's like there's loads of elements of like a Subnautica type survival crafting game here, but because we're driving around, it takes us away. We can't like build permanent things and stuff like that. So like there's this kind of holistic thinking you have to do to kind of pair your theme and your mechanics and the kind of constraints you have as a developer in terms of who's on your team, what skills you have, and all of that kind of stuff. And it's really like I think the looking out there at the market thing that people do is often because they're trying to find an easy answer of just, I'll go and do that because that's what's popular, when actually
Mm-hmm.
the success is kind of down in here, you know. I think Darkest Dungeon is another good example of what we were just talking about in terms of not making a game that already exists, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
Darkest Dungeon 2 is structurally a totally different game from Darkest Dungeon 1. It keeps certain things that people like, but it has a totally different metagame structure. And, you know, some people will say they love it, some people will say it failed, but ultimately they went down that route because they didn't want to create a just better version of Darkest Dungeon 1, because the people who like Darkest Dungeon 1 are still playing Darkest Dungeon 1 in their tens of thousands, right? And I think with that example in mind, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with Slay the Spire 2, because I still play Slay the Spire very, very frequently, and like part of the thing that people have said about deck builders is it's really hard to build one because everyone just compares it to Slay the Spire, and it's like, does this have the
Hmm.
same amount of content as this game? Does it have the same like interesting puzzling out how to build the synergies type thing? And most of the time the answer is no, or they just go too complex in a weird direction that seems clever at first but isn't that satisfying.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, really good points there. Like with the Slay the Spire example, or with deck builders, I've seen that a lot where developers will kind of laser focus on, we'll just make a more complicated deck builder, thereby it will be better than Slay the Spire. And then you go to play that game, and it just, to return to the point of game feel, it just feels horrible to play. Like, anyone who's played Slay the Spire knows you are very snappy in terms of how quickly you can do your turns, how fast
Mm.
cards play. Turning that into now like 2 to 3 minutes just for a single turn, it just, completely destroys that sense of pacing. So while yes, it is mechanically deeper, that doesn't mean it's going to be more enjoyable to play. And with Darkest Dungeon, I think that's another good example of, as you said, like, there's always that kind of push when it comes to sequels of games as to what you want to do. Like, we could, like, I think there's a really good compare and contrast between Darkest Dungeon 2 and Silksong. That Darkest Dungeon 2 is entirely different. It does not play anything like the first game. And in a way, it prevents it from kind of like invalidating it. Because I've seen, I guess, like, here's an interesting question for you. When we look at some sequels, there's always, like, I think two kinds of sequels. One that is just a legitimately different game. Like, everything that you played in one is completely different in two.
Mm.
And then there are sequels that kind of feel like, in a way, they invalidate or they kind of supersede the first game. Like, the sequel is basically the first game, but everything's now better or improved. So
Mm.
there's like no real reason to go back and play number one unless you're doing it for like historical points. And I guess
Mm.
like, what are your thoughts on that? Like from like a design, like academia point of view about, I guess like, how much you iterate and how much you just, throw it all out and build something entirely new.
Yeah, I think it depends what you're trying to do with the sequel, right? Because I think I haven't played Silksong yet. I played a few hours of Hollow Knight. It just made, I'm going to get killed for this. It just made me want to play Symphony of the Night, but I'm of that age. Um, I think, but because that's a very sort of world building focused franchise, if we want to call it that, it's adding something, and the fans of the first game really like the world, right? And the kind of that aspect of it. I think generally that is a thing with Metroidvanias. So it's like you're expanding it in that direction of like, we're going to see more of this world, and then you're expanding it in a gameplay direction, or not even expanding it, doing a slightly different thing. And I think that's the thing. It's like, if you just, I think a good example of what you're talking about, where the sequel just stamps over the original
Mm-hmm.
one and makes you go, why would you play the original one, is Rogue Legacy.
Mm-hmm.
Because the second one is just the same idea as the first one, executed with a lot more polish, but it's and a lot more content. It's like fundamentally pretty much the same game. It's much higher, it's sort of glossier art and not pixel art, and there are more variety of things, but it does just sort of stamp over it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's less of a shame because it's not a very story focused game, right? Whereas if Silksong came along and made it pointless to play Hollow Knight, that would feel quite sad because you've got this place to explore and these characters and everything. If it's kind of just overwriting it, then it becomes almost like remake territory. Like, you can play Silent Hill 2 and the remake and they'll spot the difference and stuff, but you probably only need to do one of them. Um, I also like it when we get studios that iterate on ideas by making games with different settings. Like Arcane is one of my favorite game studios,
Mm-hmm.
and all of their games share some sort of DNA. Prey, Dishonored, Deathloop, even though that's a slightly different studio, they've all got. You can feel it's the same game, underlying game engine when you play those games, but they all have a different way of doing the same things. Often it's like, oh, we've got a blink mechanic where we can teleport, but it's justified differently in the narrative and it feels a bit different to do. I think that's a neat way to kind of iterate on what you do, is to sort of almost do like the same game but in different dimensions and different settings, you know?
Trying to, again, like, figure out like what you want to make next. I think that's always that challenge. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the start of this discussion about for like new developers coming in. That a lot of people have that, they always have the dream idea, that one game they want to make. But then when you go to ask them, okay, so what are you going to do after that? Many of them just did not have an answer. And when I like talk to developers like either like today or like the last 5 years, when I ask them like what they want to make next, they can oftentimes like rattle off like 3 to 5 different ideas that they are
Mm.
excited about. And I think it really again like shows how much like things have changed in terms of I think trying to be more agile when it comes to getting into this industry. Because as I'm sure you're well aware, I'm sure everyone listening is aware of that this can be a very brutal industry to get into, especially if you don't know or you're not prepared for what it takes to make this game. Because it takes a lot to get a game out there, let alone trying to make one that is going to compete with the next Hollow Knight or the next
Mm.
Limbus company, or not Limbus company, Lethal Company, and so on and so forth.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. I mean, I got my first job when I was like 28, and I had a portfolio of games I'd worked on in my spare time, and some of them were digital games, and some of them were board games and stuff like that. But none of them were finished, right? And it's really interesting because if you look at like YouTube and what game dev education is like on YouTube, there's obviously a big draw to someone having a released indie game and then being like, listen to me because I sold this many copies. But that's not necessarily what would get you a job in a traditional studio, because in a traditional studio they want you to go, here's what I tried to do, here's why I did it, and here's what I learned. And you can get quite far with a portfolio like that. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I've never been the sort of person that has like one big project that they're always thinking about, and that's the thing that they want to do with their life. I think I was probably like that at some point, but I just don't remember it. And
Mm-hmm.
I think one really helpful thing for people to do, because I've worked places like this, and I think it was a very helpful thing for making sure we always knew where we were going. Is I saw a question posted on Reddit the other day, and it was someone saying, why do people, when they're a solo developer or very small and working in their bedroom, why do they brand their studio? Why do they pretend to be a studio? And my answer to that, I think, relates back to what you were saying a moment ago. Is like, if you come up with a brand for your studio and you decide what your studio does, it's going to be way easier to like orient yourself in terms of like the space that you're working in and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can say, okay, we make games that have this kind of tone, and we make funny games, or we make very serious dark games, and we make games that test these set of skills, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you see this a lot with puzzles, right? Like people that have made loads of games, but they've never made a game with a puzzle in, and then they've decided that the next game is going to have a puzzle in, and then they're like, "Oh, how do you make a puzzle?" It's like, yeah, that's a whole skill set, right? Like that's why you
Mm-hmm.
get you get people that specialize in that. So, sorry, I'm not really answering your question, but I think I do think there is a good it can really help you narrow down the decisions about like what thing to work on if you sort of just decide, right, we're setting up this company, even if it's only in your head, that makes this type of thing. um I think people get pulled in all sorts of, and I think part of it is just being honest with yourself, because you might get pulled in all sorts of directions trying to do different types of projects, and some of those projects are fundamentally learning projects, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're going, oh, I don't know how to build a dialogue system, so I'm going to make a visual novel. And it's like, okay, well, do that to learn that, right? But don't necessarily trick yourself into thinking that that's a project you actually need to finish and ship.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because, when you hear these quotes about how many games are being released every day, is it 50 a day on Steam currently? I think that's the average.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that doesn't really account for the fact that 45 of those are like people's hobby learning projects that they've just decided to spend $100 putting on a storefront, even though they probably shouldn't have, you know. And I think there's that level of just being honest with yourself about like, okay, this is the thing I'm going to make next. Is this a serious thing that other people want to consume, or is it just me learning how to do a new thing, which is totally fine, and everyone needs to do that. But um, yeah,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And being able to distinguish between like those kinds of projects is another very hard aspect when it comes to game development. Because at the end of the day, you do need to finish your projects, but you don't need to immediately like rush and put them on Steam and try and sell them, even for like 99 cents or $1. But again, it's always that rush of, can I make this, amazing game? I can surely make the next Doom on my very first try, or maybe my second try. It's gonna be just that easy. But as we said, like the bar has gone so high these days that it's very like intimidating for a lot of people to try and get into this and learn. You'll have people, and I've seen this from a lot of like newer developers, who get into this cycle of, I'm gonna try something new. Okay, it doesn't work. I'm gonna try something else new. Okay,
mm,
I'm not liking it. I'm gonna try something else new. And they end up with, 20 unfinished prototypes and not one single game finished.
yeah. I think yeah, that is a problem that people face. A part of it is that there's never really a stage where you just think about it, you know. And I think I'm getting very old man yells at cloud here, but most of my best design thinking happens if I go for a long walk and mutter to myself like a crazy person. And I think having the space to just think about stuff without reading, without like consuming any media, just thinking about it is really helpful. And like, if there was any practical advice I had for anyone who was just starting out now, it would be, do as many small projects as you can in a year. And if you're in a real rush, in 6 months, do like 3 game jams or 4 game jams in 6 months, or do like 6 game jams in a year, right? And then at the end of that, take a month where you just really analyze what you learn, go back through all those projects and think, out of these projects, which did I get the most excited about? Were there any of these projects where other people got excited about it? And which of these did I enjoy making? Which of them didn't I? And like, which of the skills from all of these do I want to take forward into another project? I think that can be really helpful to do. And sometimes people do just luck out and a learning project naturally progresses, right? So I'm sure you've got more examples of these, but games that started off as Ludum Dare games and went on to become big games, right? So Mini Metro is a good example of that. Mini Metro has sold millions and millions, and that was started as a Ludum Dare project. And the developers went, right, they listed out a list of constraints. There's a really good post-mortem of this on Game Developer, and it was like, we can't draw characters, we can't make levels. There's loads of things we can't do. What can we do within that? Oh, we can make a game based around a metro map. Okay, great. And now it's like the best-selling game about trains that's ever been made, and it doesn't have a single picture of a train in it. Um, and yeah, you can sort of have these very humble goals of just doing a little game jam game, and then it kind of grows from that if it ends up being something exciting. We've got someone in our Discord who's working on a soccer band game. He's not like a massive fan of that genre. He just tried to make one for a game jam, and then it ended up being really neat. It's called Hazard Pay. It's like you're disposing of like bodies and evidence from bad science experiments, and you're pushing things into vats of acid and stuff. So it has like a slightly different theme from what those games normally have. But that was an example of a game that's gone into like a full production thing that he's been working on for a year, and that was a game jam game. But I really just think doing as many small projects as you can in a condensed amount of time, and then rather than just always looking ahead, making sure that there's a review period where you look back on them and think about what you learned from them and which ones of them held the most promise for you,
Mhm. And like with some of the examples that we've seen, like from like game jams and stuff like that, as a way to kind of grow a game from, as you said, like trying to like find what game kind of like speaks to you can be very difficult for a new developer. And we've seen people kind of chase that, I want to make a shooter, but okay, the shooter doesn't work. I want to make a platform. Well, that doesn't work. And as we've said, it's why it's very important to be able to study these genres to start figuring out, do you actually like making this game? And it sounds, I think, very simple when we put it like that, but again, there have been developers who've tried to like chase whatever is popular, and I hate RPGs, but I'm making an RPG. Well, then why are you doing that? Well, because I saw, Expedition 33, or I saw Metaphor, or Look Outside, if you're in Hunger, you name it. But if you're not able to understand why someone really loves the genre, you don't love the genre, you're going to end up with something that just feels like a derivative of a derivative.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where that kind of fundamental thing of being excited about entertaining people and seeing it as entertainment is really, really helpful. And that's why you will often get people that come from more arts backgrounds and have only really learned the basics of like the computer science side of things, who go on to make really good stuff because they sort of understand the whole thing of, this is for someone else, this is to like make someone else feel a way. Yeah, I just keep saying it's difficult, but it is. But I think a lot of it comes down to, is it enjoyable as well? And I think I get very frustrated with questions about like, how do you get into this? How do you do this? And it's like, okay, there are obviously people in the world that have a economic or educational barrier in some way to starting to make games, but it's way easier than it was when I started, in a lot of ways. And I just, I guess I heard Tim Kaine express something about this recently that was very, very close to my feeling on it, which was just like, there are loads of people that are doing this just because they enjoy doing it, right? And that means that they do it for big blocks of time, big chunks of time, and they don't really have any goal of like making money from it or making a successful game. They just do it because it's like a interesting intellectual exercise to them. And there's tens of thousands of people like that. And if you're not one of those people, I can't understand why you would do it. And that there are lots of sort of areas of like questions that people have about making games that sort of fall in that space for me, where it's just like, well, if you're not fundamentally driven to make a game regardless of whether or not it's successful or anything like that, then I don't have much to say to that, because it's to me, that's like speaking to an alien. This is stuff that I've been very, very fortunate to have a bit of a career doing this, even if it was started quite late. But one of the things about games for me is like, I got into making games because they contained every other thing, right? They're a young medium, and they sort of take and converge every other type of things that humans have ever made. It's like, you can play a game and you can go, oh, this game is chess and dancing, and this game is like architecture and hide and seek. Every game has all these other things that humans have ever done in it. And I always liked drawing. I always liked music. I always liked. For me, I would get interested in a medium or a type of art, and making it would just be part of my appreciation of that thing, right? Just like they teach you in art classes, where it's like, hey, we're gonna do master copies and learn how to appreciate this art by copying it. I would always do that all throughout my life. It's just part of enjoying culture and art, is getting involved in having a go at it. And I got into games because it was a way to do all of these other things and put them into one thing. And I just find it very, very difficult to understand the sort of drives of someone that isn't like that. And I do understand that we have more distractions now. It's difficult, post iPhone and social media, it's a lot harder to just sit down and focus on something and like get lost in it. But I guess maybe it's naive, maybe it's romantic, but I feel like good work is usually just the product of people being really interested in something and committing a lot of time to it. And sometimes bad stuff comes out of that, and sometimes good stuff comes out of it. But ultimately, it's sort of law of averages that if you're the sort of person that spends 20 to 30 hours a week doing something because you find it interesting, you're more likely to produce something fun than someone who is like, trying to. A lot of the questions you get as an educator in this space are basically people trying to mitigate risk or avoid doing work that they think is useless.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, should I do this or should I do this? It's like, well, you should probably do both a little bit and then use that data to work out which one to do. Oh, yeah, but I don't want to do that. I just want to know what the right answer is from the get-go. Well, sorry, that's not how design works.
We're going to cut this podcast here. This is another 2-hour discussion that we had. So I'll be posting part 2 later this week as we continue our discussion about game design and kind of video game academia. Hope you enjoyed things. Be sure to do all the YouTubing stuff. If you're interested in coming on for a podcast, be sure to reach out. Have a good rest of your night, and be sure to tune into the remainder of this cast coming really soon.